Mr. President, I'm here to talk about a condition that's in the state of Florida, which is not a very good one, because what has happened is the accumulation of hot weather with extra nutrients in the water, aided and abetted by the release of water as the level of Lake Okeechobee rises, and that water having to be released because of the pressure on the dike, released to the west in the Caloosahatchee River, to the east in the St. Lucie River. All of this has created a condition, as I said, mixed with the humidity and the heat of the summer, for the water to be so ripely laden with nutrients that algae starts to grow, and then it starts to bloom, and then it starts to get excessive. It's toxic, it's slimy, it's called blue-green algae, and it's a bloom that is spreading over those waterways. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of waterways in Florida because of excess nutrients that, in fact, have now the growth of algae, but this is particularly acute to the east of Lake Okeechobee and to the west of Lake Okeechobee. This past week, this senator went from one coast to the other. I started in Fort Myers, examining the Caloosahatchee River, talking with the elected leadership and environmental leadership. I then flew on to the lake, landed at the Pahokee Airport, went to the Belglade Marina along with my colleague from Florida. That's his district, Congressman Alcee Hastings. We had a town hall meeting there and were able to announce some good news that, as we had requested, Congressman Hastings, Senator Rubio, and I had requested to use the disaster relief money for the hurricanes, which was the last tranche, was upwards of $80 billion, to use a portion of that to help us speed up the acceleration of the construction of the dike so that the dike can be reinforced, that the lake can hold more water without the communities around the lake being threatened that the dike might give way because of the pressure of the water, the higher the level in the lake. We were able to pass on at that meeting the announcement of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the White House having utilized part of that money in their recommendations, utilizing that $80 billion as a source of money to speed up the dike. And that was a very welcome announcement, but it's only one part of what's got to be done, and the algae is still there. The one thing that I heard over and over from the people is they're worried about the potential health risk. These are health risks associated with the algae bloom, and they feel like that they're not getting timely, accurate information on what to look for and what they should do if a bloom takes place in the waterways in their particular area. Now, I want to give you some idea. These are pictures from 2 years ago, but they're fairly accurate as to what we're seeing today. You can see this blue-green algae here, located where some boats are tied up. You can see the effects of this same kind of algae out in more of a brackish water estuary, but you're talking about some serious serious growth of algae. And that's not pretty. And let me tell you, when this stuff starts rotting, the smell is awful. But the question is, what are the health effects of this? And the people are demanding answers, and they want to know, and they should know. One young woman in Fort Myers told me about something that was really rather surprising. She is a diver. She had been 20 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico, and there she encountered the slimy green algae that is usually in more of the freshwater and perhaps brackish water waterways. She said she couldn't believe it. She told me that she was worried that she may be exposed to not just toxic algae, but also to the red tide as well. Now, that's another phenomenon that occurs in a water like the Gulf of Mexico. The red tide periodically appears. It's a toxin, and it is very noxious to human beings when you breathe it in. And of course, what the young woman who is a diver way out in 20 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico is saying, when that blue-green algae meets the red tide, is that going to stimulate the red tide to release all the more toxins? We don't know. We got the same questions from residents in Stewart. After I left Lake Okeechobee, I flew on to Stewart, which is on the Atlantic coast. So I started on the Gulf Coast, went to the Atlantic coast by late afternoon. And there they were worried as well about the potential consequences to their health about the algae. Officials in Stewart were putting up signs in the emergency rooms warning people about the possible health risk. And they were urging them to report any algae sightings or exposure to them as soon as possible. But even with those precautions, we still don't know the full picture of what the algae could mean for people's long-term health. Well, Mr. President, that's why I have written to the Centers of Disease Control, the CDC, to ask that they provide the people of Florida with the information they are needed to have, including the warning signs that they need to have to look out for the immediate health risk associated with swimming in or near the algae, or even breathing it in. And that's just the short-term effects. I've also asked the CDC to look into the possible long-term effects of the algae exposure so that we can begin to take whatever protective steps that we now need to protect people living in and around these blooms. So, Madam President, I ask consent that my letter to the Centers for Disease Control be inserted in the record.
Without objection.
Just last week, the Army Corps of Engineers had announced that additional money, the $514 million in disaster supplemental funding for the Herbert Hoover Dike, and that will complete that project earlier than 2025, accelerated to 2022. Senator Rubio and I requested that. This funding is on top of what we've already spent over a decade and a half of $1 billion shoring up the dike. This didn't just happen yesterday. This happened 15, 20 years ago, and we've already spent $1 billion. Well, we're going to get it accelerated all the way to 2022. That's coming in time. But while getting that additional funding to speed up work on the dike is certainly good news, it's important to remember that fixing the dike is important to public safety to protect the communities that are living around Lake Okeechobee. It's not the solution to ending the discharging, and it's not solving the algae crisis. It's one step on the road to try to stop all of this algae bloom that occurs every year. Once that dike is fully repaired, the Army Corps then expects to be able to store about 6 more inches of water. In a big, big lake like that, that's a lot of water. Now, that's good news because that flexibility helps, especially during the algae bloom breakouts, because you can hold more water back in the lake and don't have to dump it into the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee. But the only way to end those damaging discharges is to move ahead with Everglades restoration projects north of the lake, as well as the projects designed to take water from the lake, clean it, and send it south as Mother Nature initially intended it to go. And that's why we need to get critical projects like the Central Everglades Planning Project and the new reservoir in the Everglades area south of the lake moving as fast as we can. And to do that, we need more than the small amount that the President has requested for next year. In fact, we need upwards of $200 million a year to really start making progress in restoring the Everglades. Voters in Florida overwhelmingly passed a constitutional amendment to dedicate a portion of the documentary stamp tax to land acquisition for environmental projects. That's why Florida is so sensitive to the environment. The voters voted upon themselves an increase in the documentary stamp tax. But what has happened is that the government of the state of Florida hasn't been using that money for what the people intended when they voted in a referendum. Instead of using that money as it was intended, the state of Florida has tried to divert it to other purposes, such as filling in budget shortages, or employees' salaries, or other unrelated to the environment expenses. And now we've got suits, it's tied up in litigation, it's further distracting from the overall goal of restoring the Everglades. The federal government should take the lead and do what's right. We should move forward and fully fund the only ongoing Everglades restoration projects. And we also need to get the U.S. House of Representatives to pass the harmful algal bloom reauthorization bill, which was introduced by this senator. The Senate passed it unanimously a year ago. This bill would reauthorize funding for the federal task force that is studying the harmful algae blooms like the one that I have been describing here. I hope every member of the Florida delegation, especially those that are in areas where water is allowing algae to bloom, that you will join this senator in calling on the Speaker of the House to take up and pass this important bill in the House. And we need to do it fast while all of this algae is blooming and that would be before the House goes out in recess for their August break. Time is critical, and again, I want to show you what this algae looks like. You can see these thick chunks on the surface of the water where it almost looks like a blue-green carpet. And when that algae dies, you can't believe the smell that comes off of it. It's time to act, and it's time to act is now. Madam President, I yield the floor.